Okay, so we are on Daf Nun Vav Amid Aleph. We finished the previous sukkah. We're starting a new Mishnah, and actually we're going back to our previous discussion. We digressed quite a bit in this last couple of weeks, um, so that we are now back to the original question of when Ono applies, and the Mishnah had said when it does apply. This Mishnah on Nun Vav Amid Aleph on the bottom now is going to tell us when Ono specifically does not apply. In other words, these are all cases where one might have thought there should be Ono. And of course, Ono is, like we said, for instance, if you're going to redeem your own Masasheni, other things where you have to add a fifth in commemoration of the of your own redeeming. Here, specifically, the Mishnah is going to tell us that you don't have oino where you might have thought you had it. Okay, says the Mishnah, Elu devorim she'ein lohem oino. These are the following things where you do not have oino. In other words, avodim. If you are podeh, you redeem a slave, or shtoros, documents, meaning either contracts, notes, whatever is on a written document, the carcos and land, right? The hekdoshas, and also kodesh from the Beis Hamikdash, meaning temple related matters. For instance, you want to bring something for a carbon, or you want to redeem something that is in the Mikdash. All of those things where you would be acting in a capacity that you think would be oh no, because you're doing it to your own property, which is where oh no really comes into play. But these are specific cases where you do not have oino, and not only do you not have oino, but on these four cases, avodim, shtaris, karkos, nekdeshes, en lehem tishlumi kefel. Kefil, we know, is if someone steals something from someone else, if he is returning it on his own, fine, he doesn't have to pay kefil. But if he's caught and there are witnesses, then he has to pay kefil. He has to pay double. In these cases, you do not pay double. It's exempt from kefil. Not only that, and we know that if you depending on whether or not, and again, this applies to animals primarily, but depending on whether you just steal them or slaughter them, whatever, then there is a penalty of arba v'chamisha, does not apply. Further, shoy mechinam ein nishba, a shoy mechinam who normally has to swear that it wasn't his fault, that there was no negligence on his part, because the only thing that he'd be chayiv for is negligence, because he's not chayiv if it's stolen or anything else happens. He doesn't have to swear. And a shomer sochar does not pay even when he's supposed to pay, because he's chayiv for gneva aveda. So if there's a gneva aveda, you would think he pays, doesn't have to pay. So these four categories are very specific, that none of the normal penalties that apply across the board do not apply. And we're going to go into more detail, because Rashi it says on this Gemara Mefarish Tame. So really have to wait for the Gemara to give us depth to this question, why these four are exempt, and not only exempt from Oinoah, but from other fines and penalties that the Torah imposes on many of these cases. Okay. Now, let's just look at Rashi, because Rashi says shtaros. What is shtaros? If, for instance, hamorche shtaros legabas chov shebetocho yitlenu laatzmo. If someone sells let's say a note, you had an IOU, a note, and you sold that note, then in other words, the note that is in the star, right? So then and he takes it for himself. So we're going to see what it means by shtaros, because shtaros, for instance, kesef, you do have ono. A shtar, you don't have ono. So then the question is, what about an IOU, which is about money, but it's in a shtar? It's not the actual physical kesef, it's in a shtar. That's where the distinction is. That unless the shtar itself can be considered money, not the content of the shtar, not the IOU, that I owe you, $50, but the fact that the shtar itself, we'll see what that means, has to be the equivalent of money. Okay, so a shtar generally does not have it. Vehektish, Gizber, the treasurer of the Hektish, Hamocha Hegdish, he sells something from Hegdish, or Mocha Olosa Shenachel Mum, or someone sells his Ola, Korban Ola, where there's a mum and there is no kedusha to it. So what do? Teretz is these are all designated for Hegdish, and Hegdish, as a general rule, does not have no. V'lo tashlumi arba v'chamisha im tevach or mocher, if he slaughters it or sells it, u'mishum hekdeshus itzrich lemisnei. And so the question is, why do we single that out? Because for Hegdish, for holy thing, because Arba V'Chamisha only applies to an animal. Where are we talking about an animal? By Hegdish. We're not talking about an animal by Shtar or by Eved. So therefore, we specifically mention Arba V'Chamisha, but it applies only to animals, so it applies only to Hegdish. Lo shaykh lamema de ila tashlume arba v'chamisha, because the payment of 4 or 5 times eina neheges ela b'shor v'seh bolvad. The Torah tells us only specifically by shor and seh. Those are the only 2 cases where arba v'chamisha applies, and that only can be by an animal of hegdish. Okay. Now, we said Eina Nishba, that the Shomer Chinam does not swear Shalo Posha, that he wasn't careless, Shalo Hiskiku Torah the Shava Aleim, because there's no Torah, no mitzvah, no imposing a shvua on these 4 categories. So you see how miyuchad, how special these 4 categories are, because many of the halachas that we have don't apply. Eina Mishalem, Enigdivu Mimenu. And if it was stolen from him, then we don't pay. Okay, and that means for Moshe Masacha, who's normally chayiv b'geneva v'aveda, because his exemption doesn't apply to geneva aveda as the Shomer Chinam's does. So therefore, he doesn't have to pay. So these are the main 4 that the Mishnah, and we're going to discuss this in more detail shortly. Now,
2 questions.
Yeah.
And you'll probably tell me, we'll get to it in 10 years in some Gemara, but that's okay. But 2 things that come to mind, we're talking about staros and the value. One is that in the modern world we have, where essentially, I think like the secondary mortgage market, you take out a mortgage and let's say you had a heter, it's good, this and that, whatever, and then that mortgage, or it's with a non-Jewish bank usually, but whatever, but then that mortgage gets sold to somebody else at some discount, and so then we get, so it's a shtar that has some value associated with it because it's the new owner of the shtar can collect the money, but then we add in that there's a discount to it because otherwise why would you go ahead and take that shtar, and then more issues of ribis and so on, which I'm sure gets very complicated somewhere along the line. That's just something that came to mind. In a more practical sense, I wonder whether modern day, currency, paper currency, would that therefore be a shtar because it's just a piece of paper, but it has the idea that it could be directly exchanged for coins and so on? Is that what they're referring to, or is there something a little different in terms of what they're talking about for a shtar that's worth money?
So to your latter point, if the shtar itself is the money,
right?
See, here's the problem. The problem is that unless you're using the shtar, the paper, we're talking about the paper, unless you're using the paper for something, anything that the shtar represents is not the shtar. And we're going to see the specific example of where the shtar is the shtar, the paper itself is the focal point. But in your case, even though today there's paper money, it's still it's a fine line. It's a good question, but it's a fine line because the star itself the money, or is the content of which it represents, because it represents money. That's the key point. So I think to your question, if the star itself, the dollar bill, right? The dollar bill. So the dollar bill itself, what is the dollar bill? It only has value because there is something inherent in the dollar bill that makes the dollar bill choshuv. But it still is not the paper. We're talking about star, paper. So if paper has to be the focal point, then you've got to use the paper. You can't just say, oh, because it represents something of value, therefore there should be oh no. And we're going to see, when you see the example, you'll understand why you can't really go by what's intrinsic value of the paper, because it's the paper itself that you have to that we're talking about. So let's hold that, but it's a good question, because the chayre, it would seem that that's itself the value. All right, so we'll go to that in a minute. Now, so further in the Mishnah, Rab Shimon Omer. So that's the Tanakama. This is the Tanakama who makes this pronouncement. Comes Rab Shimon, and Rab Shimon says, Rab Shimon Omer, top of Nun Vav Amid Beis. Okay, Kodshim Shu Chayev Be'achriyasan. So he's now going to add a fine point to this Mishnah, and he says, Kodshim, things that are Kodesh, meaning for the Beis Hamikdash, whatever, that you have a responsibility for. Again, we'll see what that means. Yesh lahem oino, they have oino. V'she'ein echai be'achriyasan. But when you do not have an achrayus, ein lahem ano. There's no ono. So what does that mean? So let's understand that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there were two ways of making a dedication. One is when you use sort of the magic words harei olai. I have an obligation on myself that I'm going to bring a carbon, or I'm going to do something for Hegdish, whatever it is. So the harei olai puts a responsibility on you that you can't shake. What happens if that if the animal that he gave for harei olai, let's say it's lost. Let's say someone steals it, someone takes it. Is he exonerated? No, he has to replace it. He has to give that animal, and if that animal is gone, because he said it's harei olai, it's not on the animal, it's on me. So when you say harei olai, that means you're taking achrayus, you're taking a responsibility. Therefore, says Rab Shimon, you have to have oino. The Tanakama didn't make that distinction. Rab Shimon is coming to say, I'm going to tell you the fine points of kachim, that when you say harei olai, the responsibility is on you, and therefore kachim has to be you have to give it. However, if you don't say harei olai, what's the alternative? You say harei zu. We'll see in the Rashi in a minute that harei zu, this, in other words, not olai, not me, harei zu. This is the carbon. So l'chayra, if this zoo doesn't exist, meaning if you don't have the carbon because it's either, let's say it was stolen, or let's say it has a blemish, or let's say for whatever reason that animal cannot be given to Hagdish, then you're exonerated. Now, the harezu, the harezu means it's outside of your sphere. Ein li achrayus. I want to give something, but I have no personal responsibility. So this thing, if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, sorry, Hegdish, it's not my responsibility. So those are the magic words that distinguish whether you have a achrayus. So now it says Reb Shimon, when you have a achrayus, it should be like anything else that you do, masasheni, whatever it is, then yesh lahem, then you have to redeem it. But so then now you're chayv and oino. But where you don't have achrayus harezu, then there's no. So kachim sheish memachrayus, says Rashi, ome hare olai ola v'hifrisha v'humama umachra. Then when you say Hare Alai, now I'm still responsible. Yesh lahem ano. The kivan the im mesa o nignava chai be'achriyusa, because since if it dies or it's stolen, you have to replace it because the onus is on you, Alai, right? Zedehi, totally ish es achiv karina bay. So, in other words, a person who takes achrayus for something has to follow through. How do you follow through? By replacing it. And once you replace it, then you have to have oino. So that's what Shimon's thinking. That's not the Tanakama. Right? Yeshna v'she'enachai be'achrayus, be'achrisun, says Rashi, going to Omar Harezu. When he says Harezu, referring to the animal, not to himself, then there is no no. So this is something that the Tanakhama doesn't agree with. So again, the Gemara will get into more detail, but it's a chiddush of Rab Shimon. Then there's a third Mandi Omer of the Tana of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says not only those four, Afamocha Sefer Torah. If someone sells a Sefer Torah, behema, an animal, or margalit, and let's say an expensive jewel, all those ein lahem ano, there is no ano on those. Okay, Rashi says, af hamoicher sefer Torah, mefarish tama b'gemara b'braisa. So again, the Gemara is going to go into detail why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, these three other categories do not have ano. However, Amrlo, the Chazal, meaning the most of the Tanoim, disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and they say Lo Amru Ella as Ele, and they hold like the Tanakama Reb Meir that only the four that Reb Meir announced in the beginning, which is Avodim, Shtoros, Hegdish, Karka and Hegdish. So they don't agree with Rabbi Yehuda that these three that Rabbi Yehuda wants to include are included. And again, the Gemara is going to go into more detail so we understand what it means, what those four mean, and why they argue that the others should not be included. But basically, so now we have a Mishnah that tells us what is Oino and what is not Oino, and you see that it's not. They don't agree. Tanakama says these are the four. Reb Shimon makes a split in Hegdish. He only goes into Hegdish and said that in Hegdish it's not uniform, depending on whether you're Chai Be'achriyusan. And Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, fine, those four are good, but I have three more. And the rest of the Tanoim basically said, no, we don't agree. There is no ono on Sefer Torah or a behema or a margalit. Okay, so that's the setting. Now we're going to go into the Gemara. The Gemara is going to give us more depth here. Says the Gemara, Menahana Mili. How do I even know this? Where does this come from? And we see this often in the Gemara, that we have to rely on a pasuk in the Torah, that we don't just make it up. And we say that, fine, it comes from the Torah. What is it? What is the pasuk? Okay. V'chisimkar mimkar la'amisecha okona miyad amisecha. Okay. We have a beferish pasuk. The pasuk tells us, this is Parshas Lech Lecha v'chisimkeru mimcha lamosecha kona miyad amisecha atitnu ish es achiv. Okay, that if someone sells to his friends or buys, notice the word, from the hand, miyad amisecha, the pasuk is very clear, from the hand of his friend, then then you should not do a chet. You shouldn't do something against your brother. Each of these words we're going to see now is critical because we darshan from some of these words exactly what we're talking about. So that's the pasuk in the Torah. Now let's see. So what's the inference? What do we take from this? Dova hanikna miyad liyad, something that passes from hand to hand, that's what we're talking about in the Torah. In other words, if you sell something, it doesn't say yad in selling, but when you sell something to your friend or you buy it from the hand of your friend. So we're assuming that the word yad goes to the mocher and to the kone, on both sides. Dava hanikta miyad liyad, something that passes from hand to hand. That's what it applies to. What does it not apply to? Yotsu karkos she'ena metaltalin. So hand to hand suggests a movable object, metaltalin. Because what do you pass from hand to hand? Something that is movable, something that you can have control over, regardless of whether it's bigger or smaller. But it has to be metaltalin, something fungible that you can pass from hand to hand. What does it not include? It doesn't include karka. Karka you can't pass from hand to hand. Yotzu avodim. It comes to exclude slaves, servants, right? Because we say that Eved is doma lakarka. Also, it's not hand to hand. And Yotzu shtoros. And it comes to exclude shtoros. Why does it exclude shtoros? Because it says now here's the important question, and to Menashe, to your point, it says v'chisimkru mimkar, when you sell something, shagufo mochar v'gufo konui. What does that mean? It means the gufo, something that is the substance in and of itself, is sold, and something is bought. Yotzu shtoros she'ein gufon mochar ve'ein gufon konui. It excludes shtoros that are not themselves bought and sold. So now let's look at what a shtar is. A shtar, in every situation, even in the situation that you posed, where the shtar itself is the dollar, is the money, it represents the money. In other words, from the words that he's saying, is ve'ein gufon konui. In other words, it's what's behind the shtar, what's in the shtar, that you have to be koneh, not the shtar itself. So we're making a very hairline split as to whether or not, because by the others it's pretty clear that an eved and an eved is not metaltalim, right? Clearly, it's not metaltalim, and of course, Hegdish itself, we're going to talk about in a minute, is not metaltalim, but by a shtar, since the paper itself is representative of something, and that something is what's being traded, what's being exchanged. Therefore, ein gufon konui, the shtar itself is not what it is goof, it's only what's behind the shtar. Why? Here's important. Veina omdim ella liro shebahem. Because the shtar is only as good as what is identified in it. So even if the shtar is money, it's not itself representative. Now, Mikan Omru, this is the point. From here we see Hamochesh Derasav Labasam, if someone sells stars, meaning IOUs, money or notes, to the basam, to someone who sells basamim, spices, what does he do with it? He uses it to wrap the spices. So when you wrap the spices, then says the Gemara, yesh lahem eino, because now the shtar itself, the paper itself, is being used for the purpose, and then yesh lahem eino. But as long as the shtar is representative of something, so when the Mishnah says shtaros, it's referring to the shtaros that IOUs and money and all of that, which is not itself the paper. It's what's behind the paper. But when you take the paper and you actually use it, then you have ano.
So, but it's a real world example. They'd say that things like the paper money from places like Venezuela and so on became so devalued that they could literally use it as toilet paper because
exactly
that's
right.
what it's worth.
Yeah, right. So that's paper. That paper is the same as anything else that you would have, I know. But the shtaros, and that's why he identifies specifically. And how do we learn it? We learn it from the pasuk, because the pasuk says v'chisimkru mimkar. And we extrapolate and we interpret shagufo mocher v'gufo kone. When it says he sells, that means he's actually selling a specific thing. but the money is not a specific, the star is not a specific thing. It represents a specific thing. Therefore, and the shtaros is a fine line. The others we can understand quite easily, but shtaros, we have to really get into it to understand that unless you're using the paper itself, the rest of it is not, even though it has value, but there's no oinah because of the pasuk that says v'chesimkeru mimker. And also, we also learn from the pasuk that says, um, Kona miyad amisecha, you buy it from the hand of your friend, and from the hand, we say it has to be metaltalin. Only something that can be held in the hands applies. Something that can't be held in the hands doesn't apply. So we say that avodim certainly and kachim, and these are things that and karka. These are the things that are not held in the hand, and therefore and kachim again, depending on Reb Shimon's interpretation, harizu, harialai, but generally speaking, those are not things that are included in the pasuk. So that's how the Gemara wants to learn it. So Rashi says, right, dava hanikna miyad liyad, hizrolov babal chova. Okay, so in other words, we're very specific that that it has to be something that you can hold in your hand. You can actually hold it in your hand, and then you can trade it. Right? Shehuksha karka, because it's the eved huksha karka. The ksiv is nachaltem osem from the pasuk in the Yikra that by an eved it tells us in the pasuk hukshu la'achuza that an eved is considered an achuza, and achuza is really karka. So therefore, eved hukshu la'karka, and karka is not metaltalim. You can't hold it in your hands. Okay, Mekan Omru. Sorry?
Rabbi, there are movable items that literally you can't hold in your hand, but they're still metaltalin, aren't they? Like large pieces of equipment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're still metaltalin, right?
They're still metaltalin, right, right. I think the miyad comes to exclude those things that aren't something that can be moved, even if it's a larger object. And I mean, for instance, you can you can't take karka and shove it down amas and say, okay, I have now been kind of karka. We know that the karka is kind of a different way. L'chayra, even a large movable is a movable. In other words, yes, I can't lift it up; it's too heavy. But it's sort of self-contained, and in some fashion, it's very similar to what I can pick up in my hand, even though it's too large. So I think that's a good point. But something that doesn't fall into the category of something immovable like karka, even if it's large, is something that you can't it would be included in we'll see the Gemara asks a different question in a minute, but you're right that a large movable is still a movable. Okay. Mikan Omru Midlo Emo Shtaros El Mishum De'ain Gufon Koi Umocher. So therefore Shtaros, because it's what they represent, not what they are. So only if the shtar, the paper, is used, then it can be considered something that has oinor, but otherwise it has no honor. Hamoichesh derasa lebasam, says Rashi, lotzor brahem afka samamonim nimtza nichsa machran shal elu letzarech tashmish gufanu. So that's his definition. It has to be tashmish gufo. It has to be something that you use the paper for. So when you use the paper, wrapping paper, or maybe we can think of other examples where the paper itself, not what it represents, is being used, then there is oinah, because that's like selling anything else. That's the equivalent of anything that you can. Like Masasheni. Masasheni is a movable, right? You can pick it up, it's movable. Therefore, you have oinah when you sell it. So that particular paper is something that has oinah. Okay, yesh la oinah the gufan kani umacher. Okay, so we understand that. So that's pshat here as to why we can deal with Frek the Gemara Akasha. Okay, you're telling me that it has to be a paper that you can actually use. Pshita. In other words, how else could we come across and explain this if we didn't say that that if you don't use the paper, like in the case of the wrapping paper for the spice dealer, in other words, it's so obvious. Why does the Gemara have to tell us? That's the kasha. And we're saying here that shtoros, if it represents money, then it falls outside the category of oino. But if you use the money, use the paper, then it is oino pshita. That's obvious. What is the chiddush that the Gemara is telling us? Well, the Gemara is to say, you know what? That the paper that you use, the paper in and of itself, it has value, and you could do it. But so, what is the havamina? Because sometimes when you ask a kasha, you have to ask, what was the Gemara thinking, right? That something that is not a paper for wrapping, there's no, it stands to reason. In the eyes of the Gemara, it's so obvious that what's the chiddush? In other words, what else could it be if not that we're saying that that paper has to be the paper itself that you're using for that makes it oino. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Pshita. That's very obvious that that is what the case is. So what is the Gemara trying to tell us when it tells us? So Rashi says pshita mashno mikol metaltale the alma. Why is wrapping paper for the lack of a better example, why is wrapping paper different than any other metaltalin money for which there is ono? What did you even think it was, right? What's the havamina? So, says the Gemara, there is a havamina. La'afuke mid Rav Kana, to exclude from Rav Kana. Why? This is Rav Kana, which we had a couple of blocks previously. The Omar, Einon all the prutos. Remember, we had the Gemara that says that when you have oino, remember, you don't go downwards from silver to copper. So if you have prutos, just prutos, that's all you have, there is no ono. In other words, if you remember, the Gemara said that at a minimum we had to have one iser, one silver piece that's worth, according to the Gemara, it's worth 8 prutos. So if you have a silver piece, then you can have oino because you can have a fifth of a larger item. But when you have just prutos, he says you can't have oino. So that's what you're coming to exclude. Lafuke Rav Kana, the Oma Einon law, the prutos. To exclude Rav Kana, who says Einon all the prutos, Kamash Malon, Yeshon all the prutos. So this Gemara is now, you know what the pshita was? No, it's not that you're using the wrapper paper. It's that you can use wrapping paper that isn't worth an iser. And those wrapping paper may be worth 2-3 prutas, right? What does it cost? It's not fancy wrapping paper. You wrap fish in it. You wrap all kinds of things. The brown paper, let's say, that we use today for wrapping. So that doesn't have value. But according to Rav Kana, you can't have oino on that because it's not worth a minimum of an iser. Comes the Gemara here. This Gemara says, no, you can have oino. That's the pshita. That's the answer to the pshita. No, it's not pashit, because this paper, if you're going to use it for the spice dealer to wrap, it's good. Even if it's worth 3 prutos, you still have oino. That's the chiddush of the Gemara. In other words, arguing in Rav Kana, who had established this principle that you can't have oino less than an iser because that's considered value, right? How are you going to slice it? I mean, you're going to slice the pie. There's nothing to slice if you don't have an iser, according to Rav Kana. So the Gemara says no, that we're going to exclude Rav Kana, and the chiddush here is that even less than a iser. Says Rashi, leprutas stam moiche shtaras lebasam. normally someone who sells paper to a spice dealer, ein shama mekach shel iser biachad ella shel perutos. You don't have expensive paper. We're not talking about a fancy wrapping paper that you want to give a gift, for a matana. That may have more value. But the paper that we use to wrap besamim is just pennies. So that's the chiddush that would be considered oinah, even though it's less than a
Question.
iser. Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
So, taking this to a real question of how would you handle the onah? So when it's money, it's $1, and then you're adding, I get all confused. I'll call it 20 cents.
20%, yeah.
Okay, so let's say so you add 20 cents onto it. Fine.
Remember, we had a machlokes whether it means from inside or from outside.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Okay. And so arguably then, if the pruta is the smallest unit of money and you've got 3 prutas, how do you add 20, how do you add a fifth to it? And so that's right away
That's the
a
kasha.
very logical justification for saying you got to have a certain minimum value, 8 prutas or whatever, in order to be able to add a fifth to it, etc. It makes total sense with money. Pieces of paper. Okay, let's say normally you sell, I'll make it real simple. Normally you sell the paper in packs of 100, and it's a penny a piece of paper, and so it's $1. And so if you have onah, so it's another 20 cents, whether it's 20 pieces of paper, 20 cents, whatever. You have 3 pieces of paper, and we're saying here that 3 pieces of paper, because it's a measurable, quantifiable physical item, you could have onah, even though it's worth, 1 pruta or whatever. And so the question then is, if you have 3 pieces, let's make it real simple. Let's say you have 5 pieces of paper, and so if you add a fifth, you add 1 more piece of paper. But normally with onah, you're actually adding an amount of money, not an amount of the item. Because obviously when we talk about a lot of other items, much more expensive items, you can't just add a fifth of a car or a TV.
So I hear your question. So it's a good question. So what is the oinah if you're selling, if it's paper worth 3 prutas? That's really the question. What is it? How do you slice that pie and say that I'm going to charge oinah on something that you can't, because pruta is the smallest coin.
Right. So if you say you could do a piece of paper, okay, fine. But what if you don't have a piece of paper? And then what about just like if you have, it's a TV, you can't add a fifth of a TV. Of course, you would be doing it as the monetary value,
Right. Right. So let's think about that, because it's it's a good point. And if he's coming to contradict Rav Kana and say that even with less than an iser, you can have oinah, and iser, we said earlier, allowed you to have oinah in prutas, but now prutas doesn't allow you to have oinah in prutas because there aren't enough prutas. Right, there aren't enough prutas. That's okay. So then maybe the only we have to go back to the chayfetz, and maybe we have to say that the oinah is not in money, but in the object itself, right? In the shtar, in the paper. In other words, and that's a tough. How do you do that? How do you do that? In other words, if the paper. So what you have to cut up a piece of paper and say that this is the oinah for the wrapping paper because I sold it for the chayfetz itself. It's an interesting question. I have to I didn't dwell on that, but that's a good point. Is how are you going to answer? It's one thing to argue in Rav Kana. It's another thing in a practical sense. How are you going to have oinah on something that you can't slice any thinner than a pruta.
Yeah.
All right. So
I'm good at the questions.
Thoughts,
I'm not so good with the answers.
Yeah. So that's the question is a good one. I have to figure out the answer. So if anybody has any thoughts, let's hear them. But we'll have to look in further and see what it is that the answer is really telling us. Because in a practical sense, how you're going to give oinah? What is it to give oinah when you don't have, unless there's a minimum. Again, unless there's a minimum of a pruta, regardless of whether that's actually a fifth, because if you have 3 prutas and you give 1 pruta, that's more than a fifth. So then now you're being penalized for more than a fifth because you don't have a fifth. right? You would think that you'd have to have at least 6 prutas to have, right? Even though an Isser is 8 prutas, but you'd have to have at least, let's say, 6 prutas to be able to say, okay, I have to give one, depending on how you look at the oino, that you have to give oino. So, all right, good question, and we have to think about how, as a practical matter, you're going to give oino on something that has only a handful of prutas worth. All right,
You've said, Rabbi, you've said this in other contexts, but maybe this is one of those places where Lifnim Yeshua Hadin comes in more prominently.
yeah, and therefore, as a practical matter, you have to give 1 pruta, even though 1 pruta is more than it should be for oino. Is that what you're saying?
Sounds like that would be the concept. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that certainly has some legs to it, but we have to look further because why would Chazal penalize you? I mean, the whole point of Rav Kana was to say that we're doing it in an orderly fashion, where you're going to have a chayfetz that is, I'll use the verb, oinawable. You're going to say there is oinaw on something because it has enough value. But if something doesn't have enough intrinsic value, how are we going to slice that and say that you're penalized for oinaw when the whole item has such a small value? But maybe you're right. Maybe in such a circumstance, as I said, there's a minimum. The minimum is a pruta, regardless of whether or not it's a fifth or a third or a half. The minimum is a pruta, and a pruta. So that's what you have to give. If it turns out that the pruta is more than a fifth, okay, so be it. So anyway, we'll look further into that point, but it's a valid point. So okay, so let's go a little further. So now we've talked about this whole inyan of shtar. Now let's talk a little bit about Hegdish, right? Because we said by Hegdish, we said Reb Shimon made a chilik between Hari Zu and Hari Olai, that Hari Olai is an achrayas, and therefore you have Oino, and Hari Olai, right? And Hari Zu doesn't impose a responsibility on you. It reposes on the animal, and the animal has a blemish, or the animal was stolen, or whatever it is. Then fine, verfallen. You don't have enough. So Hegdish says Hegdish. What do we say? It says in the pasuk Ochiv, right? So remember, we said in the pasuk the Simcha. In the first part, it was talking about economy yad. So we said that's metaltalin. The last part of that pasuk says Altonu ish el Ochiv, that a person shouldn't do a chet, shouldn't do against his fellow man. Kara Ochiv. So we learn from here, achiv v'lo hegdish, that you shouldn't wrong your brother, meaning another person, v'lo hegdish. So that hegdish isn't achiv. So if we're going to say that the principle of ono applies ben adam lachavero because you've wronged your friend, then you can't include hegdish, which is what? That's the l'shamayim, right? So according to this interpretation, we understand why, generally speaking, Hegdish isn't included, regardless of Rav Shimon's position of a Harizu and Hari Alai, because he's interpreting what it means Hegdish. But generally speaking, Hegdish is outside of the purview of Ochiv, because you're speaking about your brother, and your brother means another person, not the Rabbeinu Shalom. So the Rabbeinu Shalom doesn't require you're paying an awe, and your brother does, basically. And that's how we have to look at it. So Rashi says, let's take a look. Yes, Doctor. Okay, so Hochanami Mirishus. We said before, Amisecha, Koma, Vafil Kakos, Nami B'mashma. Okay, so there's no Rashi here, but this is the interpretation that from the pasuk of Ochiv we learn that it has to be your brother, and it can't be Hegdish. Now, the Gemara now is going to go back to the whole principle that we excluded Karka and Hegdish and Shtorus is because we said it isn't Yad. Frek the Gemara, now that you're going to tell me that Yad excludes everything else, right? Maskif law, Rabba bar Mamol. So Rabba bar Mamol asked the following question: Kol hechad iksiv yodo, wherever it says Yad, yodo mamashu, right? It means the hand, and we interpreted hand to mean metaltalin. So now I'll ask you a kasha. Ela me'ato. And again, your point, David, was that if it's something that is hard to move, but is still a metaltalin, okay, that we will include in metaltalin. Ela me'ato vayikach is called arzo miyodo. So the pasuk tells us, right, that, and Rashi will explain that by Sichon. So when Sichon took the land from Moab, and it says Biyado, and we're talking about land. What does it mean he took the land? Biyado? Can't be Biyado, because Biyado has to be metaltalin. So he wants to slug up the whole principle that we said why you don't include these is because they're not Miyado. But we see a pasuk in the Torah, right, that tells us that Yodo doesn't mean just metaltalin, right? So take a look. So Rashi says, let's take a look. Okay, no, again, so Rashi doesn't talk about that, but the kasha here is that the word yad is used in a context where it can't be yad. Hochinami, the kol Arabi yada havinoketle. So that if the land is what he put the land in his hand, of course he didn't put the land in his hand, right? Elo mishuso. So now we have to take a broader interpretation. Yad in that case means rishus, right? Hochinami rishuso. If you're going to tell me that by sichon it means not yad, but it means rishus, then everything in his rishus, if he has karka or he has an eved, that's in his rishus. So now all of a sudden the kasha is, why are those excluded from Oinah? If yad means rishus, not just metaltalin, then you should include all of those other items. So that's the Gemara's kasha, is how are you now interpreting yad to exclude all those others? And for the Gemara, v'chol hechad iksiv yado. No. So now we're going to reinterpret what the Gemara means. Lav yada mamishu. When it said yad, it doesn't mean exactly hand, right? It doesn't mean exactly hand. For Tanya, we learned in a brisa, im himotze timotze biyodo, right? By Geneva, if the Adim found the item in his hand, whatever, in his hand, right? Ein lo ela yodo. Gabe chatzera v'karfifa minayin. So by a ganef, if the Adim found the stolen item in his hand, he has to be careful. What about if the item was not in his hand? It was in his rishus. He put it in his house, or the chatzero, or karfifa, or his roof. In other words, it's not on his person. It's in his possession. Do you not pay kafel? In a regular case, do you not pay kafel? Of course you do, right? So because it's bershuso, so therefore the term yad has an expansive definition, and it means rishus. Talmud lomar imimotze timotze b'kol mokom. Therefore, from the Torah's perspective, that finding it is anywhere. It doesn't mean just yad, right? So in other words, you're telling me that yad means just yad. We're seeing that it has a much more expansive definition than just yad. So Talmud iksiv rachmone himotze himotze. The reason why the Torah says himotze himotze bayaganav holav hochi. If not for this, hava amina kol hechad iksiv yodo yodo mamishu. I would have thought that everywhere it says yad, it means yad mamish, to the exclusion of everything else. Therefore, it comes to tell us, no, that yad doesn't mean yad mamish, but it also includes, let's say by the ganef, it includes you do have kefel when it says that he has to pay. So because we say that by ganef, outside of that, it would be yado yad mamish. So the Gemara wants to learn from here that by a ganef we say yad, and we don't mean specifically yad because it's specific about a ganef. That a ganef has kefel, even if it's his rishus. But in any other circumstance, holav hachi hava amina kol hecha, we would say yoda mamish. But if not for the pasuk that it says he motze, in other words, the pasuk by Galef is specific that if you find it in his hand, and because it says he motze twice, the second motze includes rishus. So that's the only reason why rishus is included by a ganef, because it says it twice in the pasuk. Remember, again, the Torah is very specific. So the Torah should have said imimatze beganef. Could have said that if you find it by the ganef, then he is chayiv and kefil. Because the Torah repeats the word, we darshan from that second word that ganef is different than other circumstances, but by a ganef you have rishus, but by everything you don't have rishus. So again, it comes back to the reason why we say that the kasha that Rabbi Bar Mamel asked on from the pasuk from Sichon is that there are times when the term has a broader meaning, and times when it doesn't have it. If the Torah announces with a specific extra word or a drasha that it means rishus, it means rishus. But that's only the exception to the rule. The rule is that when it says yad, it means yad mamish. So in our case, where it's yad mamish, therefore only metaltalin are included and nothing else, right? So that's the pshat here. Now let's go a little bit further. We have another V'su Tanya. We learned another brisa by Gittin v'nosan beyoda, that if you when you divorce a woman, you have to put it in her hand. You have to say before the nechta, which we know from the previous Gemara, but you have to place the get in her hand. We say ein li ela yoda, that it's not just her hand. Gaga chatzer karfifa minayin. How do you know that? Which the halacha is that if you don't put it in her hand, but you put it in her dalat amas, that she is divorced, right? Because Talmud Lomar v'nosan mikol makom. Again, there's a specific drasha from the word v'nosan that you place it, and the term nosan says it doesn't have to be biyada. But again, this is an inference that when it says yad, it means exactly yad. It's only when there's an exception to yad, like we saw in the case of a ganef or in the case of a get, when there is a specific exception to the word, then we say it means more than yad, more than rishus. So that's the interpretation, that yad still means so tama d'ksiv rachmanon v'nosan. So the reason why you can give her the get is because it says v'nosan. Holav hachi. Without it, havamina kol hecha d'ksiv yoda mamish. I would have thought that when it says mamish, it means mamish. So again, this is a support for our point that when it says yad in the Mishnah, regarding the Mishnah, it means l'talfun, because the Gemara wanted to show that no, it doesn't mean yad mamish. You see that there are cases when yad refers to land. So now the Gemara is giving us examples by Gittin and by Geneva. There may be other examples, but these are the two the Gemara are giving us, that there's a reason when it says yad that we go and encompass rishus as well, because a specific pasuk in the Torah that includes other words, and therefore, right. So says the Gemara. The Gemara then says, "Ela kol yoda mamishu." Every time it says yad, it means yoda mamis. V'she'ena v'shani hosam the lekalameimar hochi. But where in the case of Sichon, right? So now we gave good examples. What about Sichon? Sichon, it says Yodo and it was Karka. So we say no. Yad means Yad Mamish. Vishani Hossam by Sichon Delekalame Mahochi. Because as a practical matter, you can't say it means Yad Elabrashus. So in other words, he's saying that because of the circumstance that we see that Sichon we're talking about land. So just like we make an exclusion by Geneva or by Gittin, we say by Sichon it can't mean Yad Mamish because it talks about land. Ela B'Shuso that so he took the land and it was his possession. So basically, the Gemara is telling us that we have to look with a fine sort of point. That yad is generally just metaltalin. Wherever yad includes something more than metaltalin, we look behind it because there's usually a reason why it's more expansive. And clearly, the psukim in the Torah by Ganef and by Get make that point. But he's saying also in the case of Sichon that Efshar, you can't say he means just metaltalin because we're talking about land. So in other words, even though that lechara looks like it's a stira, it's not a stira because as a practical matter, we're talking about something different. The Torah just uses that word as it does by Gittin and Geneva, but it also means that it's more than land, more than metaltalin. It's in that case, it's land. So we're saying that that's not a kasha on our Gemara. We can still hold that yad means metaltalin, but those are all exceptions to the rule as to when you can. But in other words, by when it's not metaltalin, and it has to be something else. Okay.
Rabbi, does that mean so? If he uses his hand, that means it's got to be directly to him.
Correct.
If it just says to him, then it could be sort of surrounding area. Now,
right. So
now when you get to
right,
wait,
right.
So when you get to the land,
so let's see. Good point. So let's take the example by a get. What does the pasuk say? It says v'nosan. It doesn't say
right, give it to her. It's in her domain, though. You can give it to her anywhere.
Right. That's right. Because
if it said to her hand, then you have to give it to her in her hand.
Right. But by get, it says v'nosan. It doesn't say biyado or biyada. So it says v'nosan. Right.
So then she doesn't have to be given it.
She doesn't actually have to have it in her hand. Correct. And the same by Ganef, we say the words himotze timtza. Himotze would mean, yes, you found it in his hand. Himotze timtza, the extra word, what do we need the extra word for? Because the extra
word is property or something. So then it's
in his possession. Correct. Yeah. So if the Adam find the item that was stolen under his mattress, what are you going to say? Oh, it's not in his hand, so he's not Chayiv Geneva? No. Of course he's Chayiv Geneva, because the Torah tells us it doesn't have to be literally in his hand. It has to be timtza. It has to be found by him. Right. So that's the point. So now we've answered that question. And again, we're going to go into the next sugya next week or 2 weeks. But so we've now answered the question of shtaros, and we've answered the question of yodo. And yodo, we say, includes karka and avodim because they are both linked. So the Gemara is going to go further next week into detail, but at least we see the support in the Torah for these 4 items. It's still, we're going to have to understand Rabbi Yehuda, and we're going to have to understand Rabbi Shimon, but at least the 4 items, the 4 sort of head items that the Mishnah tells us, we understand why those don't require Onah, because they're different from metaltalin, they're different from what is the norm, and wherever we think of something as biyado, it's not strictly biyado because the Torah itself gives us, like you say, David, an indication that it doesn't have to be strictly in his hand. So those are exceptions to the rule. So that's pshat here, and again, I'll have to look a little bit further on the question of prutas because there we have a good question. If we're going to exclude Rav Kana and we say in our case that prutas are onah, what does that mean? How do you have prutas for Arno when a pruta can't be sliced even thinner? So that's a question we'll take a look at. But Mitzvah Shem, so in 2 weeks we'll pick up from here, and everybody should have I know it's going to be a tough few days. Shmini Atzeres is our yard site for the Kedoshim, but hopefully with Simchas Yontif we'll be able to be Mesameach even as we mourn the loss of all of these Shamas and Klal Yisrael. But again, if we say we have a Mutter Shleim in the Rabbanu Shalom, then we have to understand. We can't understand why Rabbanu Shalom does this, but we have to accept it. And hopefully we'll have other good psuras, like we just did a few days ago, to ease us a little bit into Yontif. But nevertheless, for Samachta Mechagecha, we should all have a wonderful Yontif.
Thank you.
You too, Rabbi.